going on, guys? It's Cimo. Now today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the December 2017 format. Now we're moving into the holiday season, so the game's going to be slowing down a little bit. The last large event of the year is YCS Argentina, which takes place this weekend as a matter of fact, but after that there's not really going to be a whole lot of events to go to. However, this is going to be a good video for you if you have maybe a regional coming up or a big locals, like maybe there's a case tournament or some big prize tournament going on in your area, to give you an expectation of what decks you might see going into that certain event. I know I personally have the regional, the Las Vegas regional specifically, coming up in a couple weeks, and if you're planning on attending that event, I hope to see you there. But before we get into the top 5, just a quick shout out to my newest patron, Raymond, and if you guys want to help support me via Patreon so I can continue bringing you daily Yu-Gi-Oh content, check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's get into the top 5. Starting, of course, with number 5, we have ABC. Now, ABC has been one of those weird decks that's kind of been just bubbling at the surface because for the longest time, especially at the start of the November 2017 format, because we had the new ban list, a lot of people kind of put ABC to the wayside because with everything else that there was a lot of Pendulum Magician hype, Spiral was still hyped immensely, and then Trickstar was gaining a lot of notoriety as well, that a lot of ABC players were kind of just losing traction. However, that gave ABC players an opportunity because with everyone playing a card like Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries in their deck, but they're not anticipating a deck like ABC to be at a YCS level event, players weren't ready for it and they weren't playing a card like Dragon Buster in either their extra or side deck just as a contingency in case ABC were to show up. And to everyone's surprise, at YCS San Diego, there was in fact an ABC player that took 3rd place, and at YCS Prague the following week, there was another ABC player that managed to make top 32 as well. So there's a lot of success for ABC for a couple reasons. First off, while the deck may not be the most consistent, it still has one of the strongest turn 1 boards possible. I mean, having something like Decode Dragon Buster and hell, maybe even a back row, that's a really good opening. ABC is also able to play Floodgates extremely well, most notably a card like Skill Drain. If you draw Skill Drain going up against your Spiral matchup, it's basically an auto win. Spiral actually has no main decked out to a card like Skill Drain unless they happen to main Twin Twisters, which is extremely unlikely, but being able to play Skill Drain and being able to play under Skill Drain very well, since all of your letters are going to trigger when they hit the graveyard and so on, is a very valuable asset that's basically your win button. And since a lot of Spiral players are opting to go second now, that gives a deck like ABC a very good chance because that deck wants to go first. That deck wants to establish Dragon Buster as quickly as possible. Also, since the deck doesn't really need a lot of components, you can play a lot of hand traps to counteract your other matchups like Spiral, and that's a very good advantage that the deck has as well. Now, going into the side deck in games 2 and 3, the deck can be a little bit, harder to pilot because you have a lot working against you, especially if you're going up against the right deck or the right player who might be prepared for your ABC matchup. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the deck is still strong, and that's why I gave it the number 5 slot. But moving on to number 4, it's a deck I actually wasn't anticipating to be on this list at all, but I actually went with Lightsworn. Now, Lightsworn took everyone by storm when it managed to get 2nd place at YCS Prague, almost beating Spiral in the finals, which that's like a throwback to, Nekroz versus Burning Abyss, when Burning Abyss was taking 1st place, when Nekroz was obviously the most dominant deck. So there was a little bit of deja vu there, but Lightsworn is a really interesting deck because not only did it take 2nd place at YCS Prague, it also took another top 32 slot at YCS Prague, and also 1st place at the Mega Regional that happened at the same event. And if you've been paying attention to regional levels, there have also been some 60 card Lightsworn decks popping up in the top cuts as well. And that's really interesting because that kind of garnered my attention and really wanted me to delve into why this deck is, having people gravitate towards it. And there's a couple conclusions that I came to. First off, by playing a 60 card Lightsworn variant, which all the decks I've seen that have been doing extremely well have been 60 cards, you're able to play so many bombs that you can just drop on your opponent, which are basically like auto win cards if your opponent doesn't have the answers to them. And because you're playing a 60 card deck, you're able to play so many more than if you were playing a 40 card deck. And Lightsworn's really interesting because yeah, Ash Blossom can pretty much hit all of the cards I'm referring to. You know, Grass, Left Arm, Brilliant Field. Like, there's so many cards that can just be stopped by the hand traps. But if your opponent doesn't have those hand traps, the interesting thing is that Lightsworn is able to do what Spiral does, and no other deck really has that option. And what I mean by that is Lightsworn is able to amass a board that is near unbreakable if it goes first and doesn't get hand trapped. You look at other decks in the meta like Pendulum Magician. You know, Pendulum Magician can end on something like Bagooska, or maybe an Omega, or Time Star Magician plus, you know, Time Pendulum Graph, and that's a pretty good opening, but I wouldn't call it unwinnable or an unbreakable board. Same thing goes for ABC. You know, ABC ends on Dragon Buster plus Decode Talker. That's a strong opening board, but nowhere near just completely unbreakable or unwinnable. Lightsworn, on the other hand, if you get the right mills or if you get the right cards that go off because your opponent either preemptively uses their hand traps or uses their hand traps incorrectly, you can just flat out win just because of the sheer amount of advantage that the deck is able to amass, because you play so many powerful cards in the deck that your opponent can't possibly stop them all, and if they're unable to do that, Lightsworn is just going to carry you all the way to victory. This is a deck that I'm really anticipating a lot of people are going to start playing and picking up, because not only is it really strong if it goes off, but it's also a lot of fun. Lightsworn's one of those decks that is a fan favorite. I think a lot of people, if they're looking for something new and refreshing in this meta, Lightsworn is going to be the deck that people gravitate towards. Now, moving on to number 3, I did just mention it in the last deck's discussion, but Pendulum Magician is still going to be hanging strong at number 3. Now, Pendulum Magician has been on a downturn over the course of the last month. I mean, YCS San Diego, there was a fair bit of Pendulum Magician in the top cut. One of them almost made the top 4, in fact. It was just very short of making it. And then at YCS Prague, there was only 2 Pendulum players in the top 32. That's a massive downsize over just the course of a week. By comparison, that's when we saw the rise of Lightsworn, even though it was only 2 slots. But you have to think, there was an equal amount of Lightsworn players in the top cut as there were Pendulum Magician players. And that's a really big deal if you think about it. Pendulum Magician, however, has consistency behind it. It is one of the most consistent decks of the format. The biggest weaknesses of the deck is it's not able to do anything utterly crazy. I mean, it can OTK because of the Pendulum mechanic, and it's able to turbo out Bagooska and Omega, and it's able to do a lot of really good things, but it's kind of one of those decks that's really well-rounded, but doesn't do anything completely unfair. I mean, apart from, let's say, like the Pendulum summoning mechanic itself. It's a deck that is very consistent at doing the same thing, but it's nothing that your opponent really can't deal with at any certain level. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can handle the Pendulum Magician deck, especially when you go into the side deck in games 2 and 3. There are a ton of different cards that you could opt to play to help deal with that deck. I mean, the deck gets blown out by Evenly Matched hard. You've got Magical Spring now, you've got Unending Nightmare, you've got Dimensional Barrier. I mean, everyone is just playing so many different outs to the deck that I think that's why we've seen a decline in Pendulum Magician players, because I think the mentality is if so many people are just playing cards against the deck, or if it loses so hard to a card like Evenly Matched, I think players are trying to look for alternatives and just have a deck that necessarily just has better matchups, because ultimately, compared to our number 1 and number 2 pick, Pendulum Magician just gets completely outclassed. Now, moving on to number 2, we have Trickstar. That's right, Trickstar has moved its way up to number 2. We saw that at both YCS San Diego and YCS Prague, Trickstar were not the star of the show, but they were definitely in second place, because not only did Trickstar have a lot of top spots in the top 32 cut of both YCS San Diego and YCS Prague, but Trickstar was in the finals of YCS San Diego and managed to get very far at YCS Prague as well. Trickstar is really interesting because it's a deck that's able to use a lot of hand traps in a very similar sense to a deck like Spiral, but it doesn't necessarily lose to these hand traps either. Now, what I mean is the engine is so concise that you can play all of these different hand traps, and it doesn't really affect your consistency a whole lot, because you have cards like Candina, Light Stage, Terraforming. They all search one another out, and as long as you can get to one of those to ultimately get to your Trickstar reincarnation, that is your ultimate card to disrupt your opponent, and that's what's going to put you in the driver's seat to win that game. With all the searching going on in the current meta, it's very easy for Lycanroc to just get in there and burn your opponent to death, and with all of the loops, like with Lilybell, we saw that at YCS Prague with the Firewall Lilybell loop, that was absolutely hilarious, and the fact that the deck is very versatile in the cards that it can play, because there's a lot of variation in what builds people play. I mean, some people are playing Wind Witches, some people are playing Invoked, some people are playing Pure. There's a lot of different card options for a deck like that, so when you're crafting the deck, you have the chance to deviate and kind of adapt to the meta that you're deciding to play in. So I think when you take all of that into account, Trickstar is definitely deserving of that number 2 slot, and only one deck really reigns supreme in this meta by comparison, and that number 1 pick has to be Spiral. Now, Spiral is obviously dominating the format as it currently stands. I mean, at YCS San Diego, it had, I believe, 17 of the top 32 slots, and at YCS Prague, it took 16 of the top 32 slots. Spiral is just completely in another league when it comes to this format, and is definitely worthy of that number 1 slot. I mean, we've discussed Spiral a lot in depth on this channel. It's just able to just do so many powerful things. If Double Helix hits the board and you don't have the answer for it, then it's just absolutely game over for you. It's kind of redefined how this entire meta works, and basically made it that any deck that can't play hand traps or sustain hand traps really has a difficult time performing, because it's not able to stop what Spiral's able to do. But outside of Double Helix, you've got big cards like Spiral Sleeper, which is a very problematic card for a lot of different decks to deal with, especially if it's equipped with the Last Resort and backed by a Spiral Resort field spell. Honestly, some decks don't have an out for it, and it can be a win condition in its own right if Double Helix does get stopped. So for the rest of the format, Spiral's going to reign supreme. I think Spiral's going to be on top until we get the January 2018 ban list, but we're just going to have to see how it plays out. I don't really think the meta is going to deviate too far from this top 5 list. The only honorable mention I would have is, say, Infernoid, because Infernoid's like been hanging on by a thread and has been doing quite well at high levels. It's able to go first and second, and has a lot of very similarities and parallels to Lightsworn in the way that it functions. But guys, that's it for my top 5. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top 5 decks for the December 2017 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.